Hi, Dr. Alex here, and welcome to a new video entitled When the BBC Became Worthless. Hint, it's earlier than you think. Now, I was not expecting to make this video until some unspecified point in the dim and distant future. However, I was somewhat hoisted by my own petard because I boasted on Tzvi Lebetkin, the Rabbi From Another Planet's video in one of his comments that I knew when the BBC had become worthless and had the evidence to back it up, only to then have this boast called out by multiple replies saying, well, come on then, show us, tell us. So I kind of had to. I was hoping to be making a Doctor Who based video, but there have been some slight delays, only slight delays, and I'm sure it'll be along soon. But given that video is not yet ready to be made, I did find myself with the time to actually fulfill the request to make this video. Now, the earliest signs that the BBC were in trouble go back quite some way and don't begin in the programming area you might expect. Certainly not the programming area that finally convinced me that there was no hope, it's time to pull the plug. The BBC is a dead parrot. But I will go back and discuss some of those early signs of imminent death. The first and most obvious signs to my mind of impending doom came in the BBC's news output. When I was growing up, my parents would regularly listen to Radio 4. Of course, we'd watch BBC News quite a lot on the TV. And when I finally left home and went to university, I kept the habit of setting my alarm to being Radio 4. So I'd be woken up by Radio 4. Well, in those rare instances where I had set an alarm and could be reliably said to have woken up. And certainly post-university, I maintained this habit for quite some time to have my alarm set to Radio 4 so I could listen to Radio 4 and the news output in the morning and get up to speed with what was going on in the world. However, while I was still in university in the early 90s, it was already clear that the BBC's news was slipping into a less rigorous and more tabloid and exposé style of news presentation. In 1994, while I was indeed still at uni, at least the first time, the BBC produced a comedy programme called The Day to Day, which was a brilliant satire and spoof of the news output. But the disturbing thing was just how close it was to where the news already was, even at that point. The reliance on over-the-top graphics and animations,
Welcome. On The Day to Day tonight, David Owen emerges shattered from Oliver Reed.
I don't think I've ever seen anything quite such, so totally wanton, ghastly, mess, terrible.
And Portillo's wife defends crack habit.
It's cheap, very cheap.
the confrontational and sneering attitudes of the news presenters and interviewers that were employed.
Volunteered to put himself in prison in order to highlight the plight of Britain's jails.
The Prince made the announcement at some speech or other he was giving today.
Tomorrow sees the opening of the London Jam Festival, selling pots of jam, some made by celebrities, to raise money for the homeless. With me is one of the organisers, Janet Breen. Janet, thanks for joining us this evening. This must have taken a heck of a lot of organising.
Yes, well, it has, actually. To get all the celebrities to contribute their jam has really been quite an operation.
How much of your time did you put into it?
Oh, I would say at least 6 months.
6 months? To raise money for a jam festival? Isn't that rather stupid?
No, I don't think so. I mean, it's all in a good cause.
Oh,
it's for the homeless.
Yeah, but how much are you going to raise?
Well, we hope to raise at least £1,500.
£1,500? That's a pathetic amount of money. You could raise more money by auctioning dogs.
Well, I don't think so. I think it's all in a good cause and very worthwhile and worth
You've
doing.
persuaded these celebrities to waste their time donating to it?
Yes.
Well, who?
Glenys Kinnock we've got, and Sebastian Coe.
I hate Sebastian Coe.
Well, I feel he's made a very worthwhile contribution,
What,
actually.
to the paltry sum of £1,500?
Yes.
Is that worth 6 months of your time?
Well, I think it is worth...
I don't think it is at all. I think the only reason you've done it is to make yourself look important. How dare you come on this programme and say, hey, look at me, I'm raising £1,500 for the homeless. You could raise more money by sitting outside a tube station with a hat on the ground, even if you were twice as ugly as you are, which is very ugly indeed. this been very upsetting for you? And have you anything else to say in your defence? Janet Green, thank you.
Were unsettlingly and disturbingly close to the actual news presentation going on at that point, and certainly soon after. Most notable among this type of news presentation and personality were the types of Jeremy Paxman, predominantly on the TV, whose sneering and condescending and supercilious attitude towards his interview guests was a genuine sight to behold, if an entirely unappealing and grotesque one. I was once lucky enough, in a previous regeneration, to see Paxman in the flesh, so to speak, up close and personal when I was invited into BBC Television Centre, into the main newsroom, where all the journalists and presenters were working at their desks. And in his case, he was working at his desk in his massive glass-sided office in the centre of the main office, open plan of course, where he could glower out at everybody else in the newsroom. And everyone else had the dubious pleasure of being able to see him work. Suffice to say, he exuded the same aura of unpleasantness that he managed to convey on camera, off camera. And there was a palpable air of tension between his colleagues surrounding him in the open plan office and the almost Goblin King-like Paxman in his glass throne room beyond. Meanwhile, on Radio 4, John Humphreys was doing the audio equivalent of Paxman every day, and indeed only ceased doing so in 2019. Suffice to say, sometime in the early to mid-noughties, I gave up on listening to Radio 4 in the morning because it was just too irritating and frustrating to listen to. There was just nothing but comment and editorializing and speculation and precious little actual facts and information being imparted about what was going on in the world at the time. Such is the decline in the BBC's news quality that today Andrew Brillo-Pad-Neal now stands out as the most insightful and intelligent interviewer the BBC has to offer.
Ben Shapiro, you're followed by
Andrew Brillo-Pad-Neal was an object of much derision and comedic source material back in my formative years when he was editor of the Sunday Times.
You are
really? Would you call the pro-choice position?
So why don't you
let me
just
ask you
answer
this.
my question,
Sir? I'm happy to answer your question. Please answer this one. Would you suggest that a late-term abortion is brutal?
I'm not taking a view on this issue. I'm asking you the questions.
Sir, you just suggested that the pro-life position is inherently brutal and terrible, so I'm asking you, as an objective journalist, would you ask the same question to a pro-choice advocate by calling their position brutal and horrible?
What I'm asking you is that why is it that a bill banning abortions after a woman has been pregnant for 6 weeks is not a return to the Dark Ages? What's your answer?
My answer is something called science. Human life exists at conception. It ought to be protected. Now, back to my question to you. You purport to be an objective journalist. BBC purports to be an objective down-the-middle network. It obviously is not. It never has been. And you as a journalist are proceeding to call one side of the political aisle ignorant, barbaric, and sending us back to the Dark Ages. Why don't you just say that you're on the left? Is this so hard for you? Why can't you just be honest? Seriously, it's a serious question.
Mr. Shapiro, if you only knew how ridiculous that statement is, you wouldn't have said it. And
it's not to say that Andrew Neil is not a competent interviewer. The clip I'm showing shows he is good at his job and can ask insightful questions and deal with a tricky, and in this case, uncomprehending interviewee. But that Andrew Neil can be held up as the best example of BBC interviewing now is a bad sign and just shows how far the BBC's news output has fallen. However, it was not the death of BBC News that signified the true death of the BBC in its most final and irrecoverable form. To explore when that occurred, we have to go back to another regeneration of mine. We've already touched on previous regenerations when I was in school, and then another regeneration when I was in uni for the first time. While in a subsequent regeneration, I was in the education business, specifically in the 11 to 19 education provision. And at that time, it was imparting knowledge of science, predominantly, although also some critical thinking, i.e. philosophy light teaching along with it. And while teaching science and a little bit of philosophy to students in the 11 to 19 age range, This was done both in lessons, in a physics context, and more generally in an after-school club called the Science Cinema Club that I created, where those who were interested could stay behind after school, drink lots of soft drinks and eat lots of unhealthy snacks and crisps and sweets, and watch episodes of actual science programs. Mostly BBC's Horizon, occasionally some of the surviving Channel 4 Equinox programs, one or two of the US's Nova programs, which are in fact very similar and often co-produced with BBC and the Horizon episodes that were produced, and a few other science/archaeology documentaries that were available at the time. One of the first things that gave me real concern about the direction the BBC was heading, i.e. towards death, was the quality of the adult science documentaries that they were producing. The first one that gave me cause for concern was Brian Cox and Wonders of the Solar System. Now, Brian Cox, I can just imagine many scientists out there rolling their eyes as soon as I mention his name, because they will all have a similar reaction to his encouraging of the public understanding of science. A laudable title in of itself, but the way he goes about it is considerably dumbing down the content of the science in his programs, and it does heavily rely on Brian Cox standing on the edges of cliffs at various geographical locations throughout the planet, with the wind blowing his hair in as romantic a way as possible. Indeed, I well remember attempting to use an episode of Wonders of the Solar System to teach a planet's aspect of physics to a class of 13 to 14-year-old kids, and at the end of suffering through it, one of them actually said, "Well, it was very pretty, but it didn't really say very much, did it?" Now, I will grant you, they were very bright kids, and they were used to me showing them pretty in-depth and challenging material. But yeah, I had to say at the end of it, I agree. Yep, basically there was a lot of program and very little actually said. And it is a poor state of affairs when you've got an adult science program that is not challenging or engaging enough to keep children engaged. And just in case you think children can't be engaged by adult science programs of this nature, I regularly used the older BBC series The Planets to illustrate what we knew at the time about planet formation, the properties of other planets, and the physics and conditions on other planets.
But the complex details of their theory lay centuries in the future, and its proof had to wait for the arrival of the space age. Viktor Safronov revisited the 200-year-old idea that the planets formed from a disk of gas and dust. He set about structuring this complex process into comparatively simple stages.
Party line of the, what most people think actually happened was that you had this disk of dust, and the dust sort of settled into the midplane of the protoplanetary nebula, this disk. And you got what's called a gravitational instability that formed big clumps, things the size of maybe 100 meters in diameter.
Safronov's second stage was less complex. It was called accretion. He calculated that in a remarkably quick time, the clumps would gather together, building the embryos of planets. As they grew, a new force became significant: gravity.
A really amazing thing happens, though, that Viktor Safronov discovered. And that is, as these things start to grow, the bigger something gets, the more it can eat. So you end up with this runaway situation where the bigger guys are getting bigger still faster than the little guys are. And it's sort of a race to eat up all the little guys. And so you start off with an uncountable number of objects that are the size of mountains, and you end up with maybe 100 in the inner part of the solar system. Objects about the size of the moon, or maybe going up to the size of Mars.
Competing worlds sucked in the surrounding debris until there was simply no more to be had. In the inner solar system, where there are now 4 planets, there were once upwards of 100. How that army of worlds became just 4 was still a puzzle.
Now, those I often had to cut down to cut out a lot of the extraneous history and anecdotal content from those documentaries, which was fine for an adult audience, but not great for fitting into a classroom time limit. But the content itself was way higher level than Brian Cox's documentaries, and the children were way more accepting of it and receptive to the information it contained in the more dense form. However, this was 2010 when Brian Cox launched Wonders of the Solar System at us, and it's not quite the point of termination for the BBC yet, but it's close. I have always been vaguely aware of what this termination date was, ever since it actually occurred, because there was a point where I suddenly couldn't use BBC documentaries to either use in lessons or in the Science Cinema Club. They just became utterly content-free. And it was while I was still in that regeneration of teaching, 11 to 19, that I actually saw this occur before my very eyes. However, recently I rediscovered many of the resources I was using, predominantly large quantities of Horizon episodes, along with other documentaries going back several years and decades, even into the 90s in some cases. But I noticed there was a hard cutoff when they could no longer be used. Right up until 2011, the Horizon output was generally of a very high standard, could be used to teach people, and there was a certain style and way of making the Horizon episodes that focused on the science and not on personalities. After 2011, i.e. in 2012, virtually none of the Horizon episodes were usable in a classroom context, or indeed in an informing anyone of science context generally. They were basically worthless. They were personality-driven and almost content-free. So 2012 was the hard death knell for the BBC. This was the year in which the BBC became truly worthless. Okay, granted, it continued to stumble on for a little longer and produced some entertainment programs of some note and merit. For example, Doctor Who stumbled on for a few more years after 2012, at least until 2017, when it too died on its ass. But these were false signs of life. This is like any recently deceased person's corpse, which might occasionally move as gases are released, or the odd nerve spontaneously gives a signal and you have a twitch or a spasm from a limb. But these were basically false signs of life. The BBC was dead from 2012 on. To put a little bit more meat on the bones of this diagnosis of death, prior to 2012, Horizon's production technique had been largely involved in having faceless narrators whose only purpose was to tell bits of the story between elements told by the scientists involved themselves or other witnesses to events that occurred in whatever discovery was being discussed at the time. That's not to say the narrators were not themselves often famous. The brilliant Horizon double episode of Atlantis Uncovered and Atlantis Reborn
There are many mysteries about the past and how we journeyed from the Stone Age to civilization. Now there is a controversial new theory. It claims that historians have ignored evidence of a lost civilization of spectacular sophistication, the key to our past. If true, this forgotten episode would overturn all our ideas about the origins of civilization.
If I'm right, and our whole conception of prehistory is wrong, then the foundations upon which we have built our idea of what our society is are crumbling.
was narrated by Dilly Barlow. Now, you may, of course, at this point say, who's she? That is kind of the point, that it didn't matter who was doing the narration. It was the content that was important and the description of the scientific processes involved. Other narrators included slightly more famous names, such as Bill Patterson, Robert Powell, and even Peter Capaldi on occasion. But none of these were ever seen. So unless you're good at recognizing voices, you won't necessarily twig that they were even there while you're watching the documentaries. As I already mentioned, the quality of the scientific inquiry and discussion in these documentaries were unparalleled. The Atlantis double bill was fantastic. The homeopathy debunk Memory of Water Horizon was absolutely brilliant, particularly when they paid to have an investigation continued and concluded so they could do a full scientific inquiry of the validity of evidence for the memory of water.
College London, where Professor Peter Mobbs agreed to produce them for us. He's going to make a homeopathic solution of histamine by repeatedly diluting 1 drop of solution into 99 drops of water.
Okay, now I'm transferring the histamine into 9.9 mils of distilled water, and then we'll discard the tip.
For comparison, we also need control tubes, tubes that have never had histamine in them. For these, Peter starts with plain water.
In it goes.
This stage dilutes the solutions down to 1 in 100. That's 1C.
The Bible Code episodes uncovered the fallacies underlying the conclusion that there were codes hidden in the Bible or the Torah, and looked at the real statistical significance of any messages occurring in any text.
Initially, both sides declared themselves happy with the procedure. It was meant to be the definitive Bible Codes experiment. But the proceedings and results have never been published. We decided to rerun it. Horizon asked 2 senior academics at London's Imperial College, one of the world's top science universities, to rerun the analysis. Dr. Linda White is a statistician specializing in the design of experiments. Dr. Dan Moore is a mathematician and computer expert. We obtained a copy of the 2 lists used by the committee and asked Professor Barnatan to confirm that they were the ones used.
And so on and so on. There are just so many useful scientific documentaries made in the earlier period of Horizons up till 2011, which could be used as discussion and teaching materials up until that point. And fortunately, even now, much of the science discussed in these programs is still absolutely relevant and not surpassed by subsequent discoveries, and so we can still go back to these as resources. The sad thing is that from 2012 onwards, I couldn't use them to teach. Suddenly, all the Horizons were presenter-led. There was somebody talking to camera, a talking head. Sometimes they were a scientist, at least in the loosest sense. Quite often these scientists were academics predominantly involved in the public understanding of science. So their main shtick was not doing the science, but was making sure that people in general understood some aspects of the science. A laudable goal, but it immediately meant that it had drawn away from some of the scientific rigour of the programme and put things into a far more softball approach to the delivery of science. As I've already hinted, these Horizons were so light on content, they were unusable in terms of imparting important or interesting information to anybody. Virtually every episode had descended into Brian Cox-esque standing on cliffs with the wind blowing, rather than actually discussing any sort of scientific concepts or philosophical concepts in any depth. Now, I had recognised this at the time in 2012, which coincidentally was a time when I underwent another regeneration and left the role of imparting science and philosophy to 11 to 19-year-olds and underwent the regeneration that started me on the path to becoming the Doctor. I mean, a doctor, of course, not the Doctor. There's no way I could be the Doctor. Anyway, point is, 2012 coincidentally was when I shifted tracks into a different career path. And as such, I didn't give the problem of the demise of Horizon and the larger context of the demise of the BBC much thought at that time. Recently, however, I went back to look at my old resources because they are brilliant documentaries and I just wanted to know if I still had them. And then I, in a most fortuitous discovery, found this folder nestled in the depths of one of my hard drives with all the programs I have ever used. And as I was going through them, I started to look at them one at a time to see which ones were most useful and valuable and which ones were largely fluff and content-free. And it was as I did this that I noticed there was this hard cut-off in time, that everything up to about 2011 was mostly usable. There's the odd duff or less interesting documentary from the earlier period, of course. But from 2012, it was very obvious that as soon as we hit 2012, any documentary, mostly Horizon, produced at that point was utterly unusable and interest-free and content-free. And so that is why I pronounced the BBC dead as of 2012. So yes, when did the BBC become worthless? It might be earlier than you think, because it's 2012. But I do wonder how many people really would be surprised at that date. You might think I'm being unfair because I've already said that there's some good entertainment programs still being made at least after 2012. But having shown the death of the news output much, much earlier and the subsequent death of their science output in 2012, I will stand by my earlier statement that any twitching signs of life in the entertainment branches of their output were simply the spasms of a recent corpse and not enough of a semblance of life to denote the actual continuance of life in the body of the BBC. So, I hope I've provided sufficient evidence to justify my claim that the BBC died in 2012. Of course, anyone and everyone is entitled to disagree, but I'm just giving my own personal perspective of when I feel the BBC became utterly worthless. And now I must get back to making all the other videos I'm meant to make, and I hope to see you in the next one. And until then, to all my listeners and viewers out there, take care.
Good night.
Available from now on commercial video. The Day-to-Day, This Is Our War. Featuring the men and women who sacrificed themselves at the altar of fact. And the beat of over 1,000 pop classics.
Dreadlock holiday, dreadlock holiday. Clap, 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 clap. So young a lady. You really got me, you really got me. Gotta stop sucking now, gotta stop sucking now. Yeah, yeah, stop, 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 stop. I'm wishing on a star.
The Day-to-Day, This Is Our War. Bang after bang after bang after bang.